Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Cedral honey processed Costa Rica from Momos Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Momos, based out of Busan, South Korea, and they were a suggestion to us by Ed Takaji. So shout out to and thank you to Ed for the suggestion. This is Momo's first ever appearance on this channel. As they're a coffee roaster, I had zero familiarity with going into this review. And when deciding on which non-wash processed coffee to review from Momos, it was down to this and a natural processed Ethiopian coffee. And I decided to switch things up as we typically review a natural processed Ethiopian coffee as our non-washed offering. So we'll see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 33. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a diluted and cooler recipe at a 16.67 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Roast profile for this one, it's definitely one of the more developed coffees we've reviewed in the entire year up to this point, and I would definitely say that this is in line with a medium in terms of that roast profile, very much in line with that true medium as well, which indicates a lot of development on this one. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, and that's the very first note I took away, as it was my first time ever trying any coffee from Momos, and I could definitely feel a fair bit of it right from the start, as there was definitely a smoky quality to the cup. Focus seemed to be more on the darker aspects with a nuttiness to contrast all of that. So in a sense, it felt like an old school washed Central American coffee, which was okay. It's been a bit since I've reviewed something that may have been this developed. Even then, it's typically not my type of coffee, but we're going to see what would change from this point. Day 17, ran it through the V60, and I continued to feel so much of the development, as there were some really nice aspects hidden underneath once you get past that more smoky quality. Those, of course, being this darker sweetness and this slight savory aspect. So I do believe that they have a tea note listed on here, and that's something I noticed very early on within this coffee, was this kind of savory tea-like aspect to the cup. Day 19, ran it through the April brewer, and the cup does need a fair bit of a cool down before it really starts to pick up, as right at the forefront, right off brew, there's a heavier roasty quality right at the start. As it does cool down, you're starting to experience a little bit more of the fruit sweetness that's present within it, as well as this lingering nuttiness. So this was better. I was starting to see maybe a slight bit of improvement to the coffee, and of course, anytime I brew it with the April, the recipe's a little cooler. So we were going to continue in that direction. I knew that immediately from the first time I tried the cup, that I was going to try to lower those temperatures, maybe dilute the coffee. Day 21, that's exactly what I did. Ran it through the Chemex, and it had been the best it had been up to that point, and this was the recipe I was going to continue with going forward, as with a little bit of work and a little bit of a cool down, you were noticing a lot of the listed sweeter citric aspects underneath. A long-lasting fruit finish in the cup with this slight bit of the savory aspect made it somewhat Ethiopian-like, which was one of the more interesting things about this coffee. It reminded me a little bit more of a developed, washed Ethiopian coffee, as it had so many tea-like attributes. Even the body wasn't necessarily the heaviest part of this coffee. Some savory tea and some of those citric fruit components really did make it feel like an Ethiopian coffee. Best day up to this point. We continue on to day 22, as I attempted some adjustments with the V60 as well, and it just continued to be a little too roasty dominant. Even after the cool down, you're not necessarily feeling a lot of the better aspects of this. There's a very slight citrus and a moderate savory aspect too. This is why I decided this isn't necessarily the brewer for me, as the Chemex really did seem to kind of strip away maybe some more of those roasty qualities and focus the citric aspects as well as the tea-like aspects to the cup. Day 25, back through the Chemex, and as I mentioned, this is kind of the sweet spot I found for this coffee. Not necessarily ideal, but much better than the other experiences I had had, as it offered significantly less of those roasty qualities with a soft citric fruit sweetness. A lot of these notes are going to remain a little consistent, because this coffee did continue to remain consistent. It just took some adjustments to find the spot. A bit of nuttiness, a bit of savoriness, but a fair bit of depth to it once it does cool down, so I was liking where it was headed, at least in terms of where it started. Day 28. Even with the development, still finding some interesting qualities to the cup, and at this time I would say that there's this defined molasses-like aspect to it, as there was a lot of the dark sweetness that I'd mentioned earlier, and at this time I said, okay, I can kind of see it pointing in that direction. In addition to that, the citrus continues to dominate the cup with a robust nutty quality as well, so it was offering a fair bit, really liking the way that it had changed from that first impression. Day 30 final notes we have, and I do have to say that there was some nice structure to this coffee, as the previously mentioned darkness felt a little bit more defined on this day with this very strong and noticeable savory black tea-like aspect. On this day, I would say that it was the most defining aspect to this coffee. As it cools down, a slight bit of that sweeter citrus and a strong nuttiness is also present, and a lighter body. So given the structure of this coffee, you were seeing the development. So right at the start, you had this roasty quality to it, and then right after that, a very defined and strong savory tea-like aspect before it settled into the sweeter citrus and nutty component. Very easy to describe in that sense. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And 2 level 4s. So let's go through those real quick, and we will start with the finish level 4. I actually kind of mulled this one over because it doesn't necessarily have the most lasting finish, but you can feel a little bit of the development in the coffee, and that of course being that kind of smoky aspect to the cup. And since that was present enough to really give this coffee a little bit of that lasting finish, then I decided that even though it might not necessarily have the most flavorful lasting finish, it still did warrant that level 4 mark, though it is on the lower side of the level 4. Only other level 4 we have is the savoriness. And that was interesting to me because on the earlier days, I was kind of looking at some other directions for this coffee, the darker sweetness, these slight citric aspects to it. But I think towards the end, I was really just allowing the coffee to be what it was, which was a black tea dominant coffee for me. And that's why that savory aspect is all the way up there at that level 4, because that savory black tea was the most defining characteristic of it, the most dominant characteristic of it, especially towards the back end of this coffee. Then we have a handful of level 3s. We will start with the cleanliness level 3, and typically when it reaches level 3 for any processed coffee, that's good. However, in this case, I would say that the only reason it didn't reach that level 4 was because of just how much of the roasty qualities there were in this coffee. If there's a washed processed coffee or even a honey processed coffee that just acts like a washed processed Ethiopian in the case of this one, then it'll almost always reach that level 4 unless it has a fair bit of that development. I think oftentimes that does take away from the experience you're having from this coffee. So that being there at that level 3 just kind of does indicate that roasty quality really kind of hindering my experience with this cup. Sweetness, level 3. Yes, that's one of the better things I do have to say about this coffee is even with some things going against it, it did have a really nice sweetness to it, this kind of citric sweetness as well as a nutty sweetness, so that part's interesting. Acidity level 3, that's also interesting to me because given the development of this coffee, I would not have necessarily expected it to have as much brightness as it did, but it did have a fair bit of brightness, and that could be attributed to the fact that we also have that citrus there at that level 3. And oftentimes I can feel a fair bit of that citrus in the acidity as well. So that might have played a role in it, but I would actually say that it was a little bit of a sweeter citrus. So I just think this coffee had a little bit of brightness to it nonetheless. Spice, level 3, yes, there's a slight spice-like quality to it, and I don't think that's too surprising given just how many tea-like aspects there were in this coffee. Typically I'll experience something like that to go in line with that aspect. Saltiness, level 3. Yes, that's one of the things I mentioned early on was this nutty quality to the coffee. That continued to persist throughout the entire time drinking it, and even towards the end I would say it reached its own status as one of the more defining characteristics of this one. Smokiness, level 3. Yes, I mentioned the roast profile of this one, the development on it. It definitely did have a lot of that, and I know that if I would have pushed this one a little bit more, then you would have been experiencing this in even more abundance, possibly that level 4 mark, but a lot of my work with this coffee was toning that part down. Bitterness, level 3. Unfortunately, that is the coffee bitterness, so that typically comes with slightly more developed coffees in general. So those two things I'm happy with. But last thing I feel like is really worth discussing is the body right there at that level 2. And that was a huge surprise to me given that this is a Costa Rican coffee. And I guess it was brewed through the Chemex, but even then I did expect, given that it was a Costa Rican with a little bit more development, it might have just a little bit more body to it. But at times it was acting a little tea-like in terms of the body for me. So interestingly enough, it was on the lower side of the body for this tasting wheel for me. And I think that's kind of the last thing really worth discussing, as I think this is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I don't think it'll come as a huge surprise to anybody that this one wasn't necessarily my favorite. And right from the start, it's not necessarily the roast profile that I do go for with coffee in general, as it did have a significant amount more development than I typically like. Even as my palate's changed and the types of coffees I prefer have changed, this was never necessarily my first choice of coffees. So I think for that reason, it always had that going against it. However, I did find some really nice qualities to it because I've always said medium developed coffee isn't necessarily a bad thing. If it's done really well, then you can get some nice things from it as well. And in this case, it was well structured. So that's one of the highlights I want to point towards for this coffee, because at times you could definitely feel what they were going for, and you were definitely able to feel a lot of the flavor profiles within this one. So that's credit to Momos. I think they did a good part in that, especially for a coffee that might not necessarily be my preference. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, first and foremost, I do have to point it towards the direction of somebody that does like a little bit more development in their coffees, because that right there is going to kind of take it off the market for a number of people. But even then, if you're able to get through that part, then I think this is well done, at least in that sense, because it does give you a lot of those maybe a little bit more classic characteristics. Right at the start, I was saying that this reminded me of some old school Central American coffees, and it did offer that in abundance. You're getting a fun, savory aspect to it. You're getting some nice sweetness, not a ton of brightness, even though there was a fair bit of it as well. And then it still continued to have some of those more smoky qualities that people do really enjoy from these types of coffees. I think that's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards with this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything else from Momos, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it, or them as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the El Cedral Honey Processed Costa Rica from Momos Coffee. Thank you for watching.